I'm going to tell you what stress is and both good and bad sides of it. I think we know that we are surrounded by stress. Even in the imagination of some people, road signs and the consequences of stress, such as sleep deprivation. We also are anxious as to what may be happening next in our world. And anxiety is certainly a component not only of modern life, but also of the dysregulation that is produced by stress, as you'll hear. But we don't really understand what stress is and how our bodies actually defend us. And the question that we'll address this evening is, how does all of this stress, both good and bad, get under our skin and affect both our brain and body function? What does it do to our brains, and what can we do about it? Now, one way is to consider the word stress and types of stress. For example, positive stress, exhilaration from a challenge that has a satisfying outcome. Hopefully giving a talk this evening will have a satisfying outcome. A sense of mastery and control you have to do this, and good self-esteem. Then there's something that we can call tolerable stress. When you have all of these attributes, good self-esteem, good sense of mastery and control, but something bad happens, a bad relationship, a job, losing a job, a death in the family, but one has good emotional and social support, good material support, and can weather the storm. And then there's something called toxic stress, which I think almost speaks for itself, and often involves many of the same experiences, but the individual does not have adequate resources or support systems, and may have what we call compromised brain architecture due to, for example, early life adversity or negative events in their previous life. So let's talk a little bit more about what stress is. Even though we don't call it stress, our health-damaging behaviors, what we eat, how much, our physical activity, drinking too much alcohol, smoking if we're so inclined. But it's not just our health behaviors, it's also loneliness, social isolation, and something that many of us experience through travel and a demanding life, circadian disruption, referring to jet lag, shift work for some people, and sleep deprivation for unfortunately too many people. But also living in an ugly, noisy, polluted neighborhood with a lack of green space can get under our skin and affect health, again, through the brain and the brain's influence on the rest of the body. So we're talking then about different kinds of stressors. We're also then talking about the behavioral responses and the physiologic responses, which are influenced by those behavioral responses. And there's something, a term that replaces the notion of stress called allostasis, which is the active process of adapting to a stressful event, or almost any event that we experience in our waking life, secreting cortisol, secreting adrenaline and other substances that actually keep us alive, and that lead to adaptation. But then with overuse of too much stress or dysregulation of the balance of these various mediators, we have something that is called allostatic load. And the way of representing that on this slide is heavy weights on a seesaw. The seesaw remains in balance, at least for a time, but the wear and tear can cause internal problems that eventually will lead to disease. Now, cortisol we know very well. We hear about it in relation to stress. It often is interpreted as the bad guy because we're talking about it from negative events, But in fact, acutely, stress keeps us alive. Cortisol keeps us alive. It helps us to adapt to a situation. As you'll see in a moment, it's important in our circadian day-night rhythm. And it enhances immunity, for example, adaptive immunity. It promotes certain kinds of memory. It facilitates energy replenishment and more efficient cardiovascular function. But when there's too much cortisol and when it's not turned off after a stressful event, it can suppress immunity, impair memory, promote mineral loss, muscle wasting, and contribute to the metabolic syndrome. So we often talk about an inverted U-shaped dose-response curve. Now, let's just talk for a moment about the circadian rhythm. Cortisol goes up in the morning before we open our eyes. It's called the morning wakening effect. And it helps to get us going, helps our metabolism and activity going for the day. And it goes down and then goes up again at night. Now, if it is elevated at night, this is bad news because it can cause obesity and promote eventually cardiovascular disease, and of course contributes to, often is part of being depressed. There are more mediators, as we call them, than cortisol, and they talk to each other. And simultaneously, they influence all of the systems of the body, including the brain. So you have inflammatory cytokines, you have so-called anti-inflammatory cytokines, you have both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and something called oxidative stress, which we've heard about, but a little bit of oxidative stress keeps us alive. So it's more than just cortisol or adrenaline. It's a whole orchestra that is helping us keep functioning normally and helping us adapt. And now we come to the brain. The brain is indeed the central organ that perceives and decides what is threatening, what is therefore stressful. It creates a learned helplessness, it creates a vigilance, and it also then influences our behaviors and our physiologic responses. So what's going on in the brain? Well, we know now that neurons have dendrites, these branches that receive input from other nerve cells, and these dendrites, the branching actually can expand or contract with experiences and result in more or less connections with other nerve cells. There is also our synapses, the connections that communicate electrical information. And they turn over, they can be replaced, at least some of them are replaced on a daily basis, as you'll see. And then there's something in one part of the brain, the hippocampus, that we study that involves neurogenesis, the generation of new neurons that goes on in this particular brain area throughout adult life. And I'll say more about that momentarily. Now, going back to the circadian rhythm story, the fluctuations of cortisol over the day and the night are responsible for the turnover of a class of synaptic connections. And this work by Connor Liston, who is an assistant professor now at Weill Cornell Medical School, who was an MD Ph.D. student here in my laboratory and also the laboratory of B.J. Casey, has shown, and you can see here the picture on the left, synapses, spine synapses, which are the connections. You can't see the axon that connects to it, but you can see that there are some spines that are forming on the left and others that are disappearing over a 24-hour period. And if one interferes with that circadian cyclicity by having too much cortisol or suppressing the production of the cortisol, this formation and removal of a certain class of synapses disappears, and as Connor and his colleagues have shown, this also impairs learning, at least motor learning, and probably other forms of learning. So that's why we sort of have reactivated the old term wisdom of the body. The body knows what to do. We just have to give it a chance to do its job. With repeated stress, we've found that the dendrites of neurons, you can see on the right-hand side, shrink with chronic stress. This is not damage to the cells, but does, after the end of stress, reverse itself to some degree. And this is a slow process in animal models and in us, but the most dramatic example of this kind of dendritic shrinkage is in the hibernating hamster. This very same neurons from the hippocampus actually undergo shrinkage within hours as the hamster goes into torpor and hibernation. And then if you wake up the hamster again by increasing the day length, the dendrites grow back. And this has made us aware of some of the cellular mechanisms that are probably involved in this whole process. Now, I mentioned neurogenesis, which occurs in the inner part of the granule cell layer of this area called the hippocampus. And stress, repeated stress, inhibits neurogenesis and actually can cause the hippocampus, the whole structure, which is shown here in the human brain, to shrink. And investigators who have studied the human brain using imaging techniques have found that the hippocampus shrinks in major depression, also in type 2 diabetes, in post-traumatic stress disorder, and in Cushing's disease, which, as you probably know, is a disease of too much cortisol. But it becomes smaller as a result of a long period of chronic stress, chronic jet lag, which I mentioned earlier, the lack of exercise, I'll say more about that in a minute, and chronic inflammation. And inflammation, of course, is a component of most of the diseases of modern life. Now, there's a positive side to the story because regular exercise, as I'll tell you more in a moment, intense learning, and some kinds of antidepressant treatment, of which exercise is actually one of the more effective ones for moderate depression, are all able to enlarge the hippocampus. And the example here shows that over 6 months to a year, people who walk an hour a day, 5 out of 7 days a week, so this is not becoming a marathon runner, actually enlarge the volume of the hippocampus, in part because it stimulates neurogenesis, but also because it also causes other neurons in the brain and their supporting glial cells to grow. So regular physical activity is undoubtedly the most important behavior that we can do to maintain both brain and body health. Now, if we look, I've told you about the hippocampus, and also there's a structure in the front of our brain called the prefrontal cortex. And with chronic stress, as I showed you for the hippocampus, dendrites shrink and it loses synaptic connections and has impairments in memory, mood, and self-regulatory behaviors. But there's another brain area called the amygdala, and you'll hear more about that from Richard Friedman, in which the same stress causes the dendrites to grow, and the individual, or in the animal model, becomes more anxious, and this is a characteristic that is increased amygdala activity of depressive illness. It's also a feature of anxiety and vigilance. So these things are both happening, and the brain circuits are becoming reorganized and rearranged to handle a stressful situation. But when the stress ends, if these changes do not revert to the state they were before, then one has an anxiety disorder, and that has to be treated, or a depressive disorder. Now, an example of the prefrontal cortex, again from the same Connor Liston when he was an MD Ph.D. student, looked at medical students as a function of their perceived stress. And you can measure this with a standard inventory. The greater the perceived stress, the more impaired they were in a functional imaging test, in functional MRI, and the circuit that was affected involves the prefrontal cortex. So higher scores on the perceived stress scale predicted poor mental flexibility in a task of sort of mental flexibility, which is something that the prefrontal cortex does. The good news is that after a vacation, all of these changes reverted them. So at least the younger brain has some plasticity and some resilience. Question is, with increased age, but then we come back to the story of exercise, which can actually improve resilience. So finally, we come to the role of early life stress, which will lead us into Richard Friedman's talk. And one of the things we know with adverse environments of poverty, abuse and neglect, chaos in the home, is that there develops with chaos in the home increased helplessness and distress, impaired self-regulatory behaviors, impulsiveness is higher, mood regulation is impaired, and brain development, especially in the prefrontal cortex, is altered by early life stress, especially a chaotic home and abuse and neglect. And there's also obesity, elevated blood pressure, and elevated cardiovascular reactivity that develops as a result of these adverse experiences. The same is true in the famous adverse childhood experiences study that involved abuse and neglect, but also the same things happen of people growing up in poverty, in part because of their experiences, but also because of other factors. Again, brain structure is altered and leads to greater vigilance and greater levels of anxiety. So the brain is really then programmed to respond in a different way. And then that brings us to the teenage brain. And I'll turn it over to Richard Friedman. You're going to hear quite a remarkable story there. Please, Richard.
So it's a pleasure to be here this evening with you. And let me see first a show of hands. How many people in this room would like to return to being a teenager? Okay, so very, very few. I was actually surprised and thought nobody would raise their hand. And the reason is that the teenage years are uniquely stressful and challenging. And some of the tasks that teenagers really have to meet, it doesn't take a psychoanalyst to know that this is a time of great stress. Teenagers have to develop an identity. They have to figure out who they are. They have to find a peer group and fit in and be popular and deal with all kinds of adversity socially. And then they have to start to separate from their family of origin and make their way in the world and figure out, what their mission is in life, what they're going to be doing, who they are, how to get along in the world. So it's a time of heightened anxiety, and there are particular medical and psychiatric challenges that all teenagers face. Young people, teenagers, adolescents are a medically healthy, physically healthy group, very healthy group, but psychiatrically, they're an at-risk group. So when I, as an adult psychiatrist, think about psychiatric illness, do you know that 3/4 of all psychiatric illness in adults is already present by the age of 24 or 25? Because the peak of many of the illnesses that I see already happen mostly in adolescence. And for interesting psychological and biological neurodevelopmental reasons, which I'm going to tell you about, there's a peak of anxiety disorders and depressive disorders in young people. Not just because there are social challenges and psychological challenges, but this has to do with a quirk of the way the brain develops. And there are interesting evolutionary reasons why young people may have a heightened ability for anxiety. It turns out that young people learn to be afraid very easily, and they have a much harder time learning to be unafraid when it's no longer appropriate to do so. So when young people have traumatic experiences, they get burned into the brain in a way that makes them very hard to eradicate later on. So this is to show you that the prevalence of anxiety disorders in young people is really high. That's a prevalence, lifetime prevalence of 10 to 30%. That's a staggering number, actually, which leads to this kind of behavior on the part of parents, which may be a new behavior socially, and that is these are the helicopter parents. You know, the last couple of decades we've seen this. I've certainly seen it in the medical college because I run student mental health, and I've seen trends over the last couple of decades where people who are now, I mean, these are kids at an elite institution who, you know, are now experiencing, you know, levels of pressure and competition that's unlike anything they've ever had before, and they're doing it in ways which is different than their predecessors. And their parents look like these parents, and, you know, swooping in at the last minute to try to protect the kids from stress and anxiety and adversity. And this, I love this slide. This chicken on the right is, you know, the eternal parents. You know, they've got a kid perfectly capable of functioning independently, but the parent is very anxious and worried that, you know, they're not going to get along in the world, and, you know, they're sort of still in the nest, so to speak. There are interesting reasons why you can speculate why there's a rise in this kind of parental behavior in the last couple of decades. You know, some people think it's because there's an increasing sense of insecurity. The world may appear and seem more unsafe now than it is in the past, although it's hard to understand that because, in fact, things are safer. Crime rates are lower, despite what you've heard from politicians. Crime rates are actually lower. The world is safer, but there are events that rattle everybody, like very improbable but scary events like 9/11, market crash, terrorism. And humans are not rational calculators of risk. When bad things happen, it changes the way you perceive the world. Perhaps it's also because the sense of, you know, the sense of community is a little bit different. I was talking to Bruce before this talk, saying, you know, when I grew up in the 60s, you know, our parents didn't know what we were doing. You know, we'd just disappear for the entire day and come back at the end of the day, and how was the day? Now, it would be very unusual for parents, you know, in 2017, not to be aware, particularly in real time, with what's going on with their young kids and their teenagers and adolescents, because everyone is worried about this lively group of kids who likes to do all kinds of interesting things like risk. So on the other hand, you could say that there's a rational basis for increased sensitivity and worry, and that is the world is competitive. So for example, in 2016, 20.5 million attended college, which is a 34% increase since 2010, which just goes to show you that, you know, there hasn't been a corresponding increase in the number of colleges, it's just more competitive. So it's not that these parents are irrational and responding to nothing in the way of competitive pressure. They're there. Those things are real. But it does make you worry and wonder what is the effect of the change in parental attitudes and, you know, the sort of phenomenon of a helicopter parent on the psychological development and the identity, the self-identity that teenagers have and then young adults have. How do you see yourself functioning in the world if you always get the message from your parents that the world is a dangerous place, that you need supervision all the time? How do you handle adversity? It might be different than previous generations where the parents were more laissez-faire. You know, there are pluses and minuses to both styles of parenting, but it does make you wonder. So for example, and you know this from reading the news in the last couple of years, there's a huge controversy about how and to what extent young people should be exposed to ideas, people, notions that are foreign to them, that make them uncomfortable. So, you know, trigger warnings where kids demand, you know, that they be warned about things that might upset them in universities. Intolerance of people and ideas that are different. I mean, just the other day at Middlebury College, Charles Murray, the scholar who writes controversial things about race and intelligence, was heckled, shouted down, and so there are social phenomenon like that make you worry and wonder what is the effect of this helicopter parenting. So just to get back a little bit to the paradox of adolescence and the fact that developmentally you're dealing with a group that has a increased capacity for anxiety, so they have higher rates of anxiety disorders. They learn to be afraid very easily, but simultaneously, teenagers, as you know, have a high taste for risk and novelty seeking. And it would seem like those two things are paradoxical, that they're at odds with one another. I mean, how can you have somebody who is both afraid of the world, enhanced fear and anxiety, but also very eager to explore the world, do reckless things, etc.? How can you explain this? Well, one thing that's interesting about brain development is that the region of the brain that's very important in mediating anxiety and fear response, the amygdala that Bruce just talked to you about, this little structure deep inside the cortex, that part of the brain, which is a very, very old part of the brain, develops very early in life, unfortunately, or fortunately. In an evolutionary sense, you learn to be afraid and have a capacity for learning about danger in the world, which is important because you have to survive it. And that part of the brain gets online very fast, much faster than your prefrontal cortex, which is located right here and is responsible for my talking to you tonight. The reasoner in chief, the ability to think about the consequences of actions. If I do A, then B will happen. Or maybe I shouldn't do A because I don't want B to happen. That's your prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason. That part of the brain doesn't really develop fully until you're about 25. So in adolescence, you've got a very early development of the part of the brain that's involved in anxiety and fear. And that's reflected in higher rates of anxiety disorders. So this is just a schematic where you can see deep down inside the brain the tiny little area, the amygdala, small area, and a lot of trouble. And this is an MRI just of the same human brain. So at the same time that kids have a enhanced capacity for anxiety and fear, they're also big risk takers. If you ask yourself, what is it that puts kids at risk? The three biggest causes of mortality in young people result from behavior, not medical illness. Behavior. So that's accidents, homicide, and suicide. Those are the three big killers of teenagers. So if you think for a second, that means in theory that almost all of mortality in teenagers is in theory preventable because it's the result of behavior. Reckless behavior, largely, and accidents, which comes from risk-taking. So remember, I just said to you that the amygdala, the part of the brain that's very important in regulating anxiety and fear, develops early. Well, if we just go back one slide, it's also true that the reward center of the brain, which is the nucleus accumbens, and that area of the brain is very important in driving reward-seeking behavior. So if I were to tell you that you're going to have a wonderful meal, or at the end of this evening you're going to get $1 million, or any reward that's along the lines of money or drugs or sex, this is the area of the brain that just lights up and mediates those behaviors and sends a signal to the brain that reads like, this is an important behavior, don't ever forget about it, and conveys a sense of wanting, craving, and desire. And that part of the brain, just like the amygdala, develops early in life. So this, in part, this quirk of neurodevelopment, where you have these two regions of the brain that develop before the prefrontal cortex, help drive both increased anxiety in adolescence and increased risk-taking in adolescence. And this is just to show you, from my colleague B.J. Casey, a schematic so that you can see the nucleus accumbens is developed, the functional development is on the y-axis, and it develops early. The prefrontal cortex has a much slower development. And you see that there's a gap between those two curves developmentally. That gap that occurs in adolescence is what we're talking about. So in a way, you could think of the adolescent brain a little bit like a car that has a highly developed accelerator, but an underdeveloped brake, right? So they're just raring to go. They want to do things all the time. They want immediate gratification, immediate reward, but they don't stop to think, what's going to happen if I do this? So the story, I love this kid who, a juvenile delinquent who's on parole and wants to visit his girlfriend across state lines. His parole is over in 2 days, and he really wants to see her. So he takes a bus, this is a true story, and gets apprehended, picked up, and the parole clock starts all over again. Because the notion of delaying that one gratifying meeting was intolerable. You would think to yourself, all right, 2 days, what's the big deal? But not if your brain is over here, where there's a huge gap between the region of the brain that's driving reward and the region of the brain that helps you weigh alternatives and make a decision that's rational, which adolescents are really not that good at. On the other hand, since most adolescents survive adolescence, it's not that bad. There are ways, and we could talk about that, what do you do to minimize this risk or help them mediate the risk of teenage years? So I'm making it sound like it is a dire state of neurodevelopment, but most of us, figure out a way around this. So you wonder, well, why are we designed this way? Well, one reason is that it's very important for the species to be able to innovate and, novelty seeking. People who have high taste for novelty seeking and risk taking are among some of the best innovators. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean physical risk, could be intellectual risk, like many of the scientists here, who are willing to, buck the trend and stick their neck out and do something that's risky. So risk is, in a general sense, could cover many, many areas, but in an evolutionary sense, it's very important to have this as a behavior in the human population. And at the same time, having an enhanced ability to become anxious and afraid and learn about what's dangerous in the world is critically important to survival. You have to know what to be afraid of in order to survive and avoid those life-threatening dangers, especially back on the savannah. So if this is the state in terms of brain development, in terms of behavior in adolescence, what might we do to mitigate some of it or sort of soften the blow of adolescence? Well, one is to target those teens who are the most at risk. And what I haven't told you is teenagers are, simultaneously at the highest point of risk for psychiatric illness, but they're also at the highest point of neuroplasticity, where they are capable of learning things that, adults find impossible. They can learn languages, mathematics, to skateboarding, whatever, but their ability to be sensitive and to respond to environmental signals and cues is remarkable. So we should target people who are the most at risk in terms of psychiatric morbidity. We can screen teenagers, and we should screen them for the presence of psychiatric illnesses like depression and anxiety and treat them. And though we can't change neurodevelopment, there are things that we might do that work and things that don't work. One thing that doesn't work with teenagers is to be authoritarian. They're notoriously oppositional. And if you say, don't do something, that's exactly what they'll do. So, the authoritarian programs like DARE, where you have an authority figure from the police force come into a school and try to scare kids into being good, doesn't work. In fact, does exactly the opposite. But what does seem to work is peer pressure and peer acceptance. So if you look at the trends in substance abuse in teenagers, if a drug falls out of favor in a peer group, the rates of that drug go down. And the converse is true. When something is seen as cool or desirable, the rates of the use of that drug start to go up. Or if a famous person, who's a role model for teenagers, has a bad thing happen to them because of the use of a drug and gets a lot of media attention, the rates of the use of that drug will plummet. So they're uniquely susceptible to peer pressure and to role models. So there are ways to do this. And this is an example of leveraging the sort of oppositional, defiant behavior of adolescents and turning the tables on them, so to speak. I love this study. So they took a group of about 500 eighth graders and they randomly assigned them to two different groups. This was to get them to eat healthy food. One group read the kind of article you often get in health class and explained, how the body processed food and recommended a diet low in sugar and fat and showed them really healthy food. The second group read an expose of the cynical practices by food companies, such as, putting chemicals in food, et cetera, and making it more addictive. And the idea was to make kids think that eating healthy food was an act of rebellion against the companies, these nefarious companies. And it worked. The teens who read the expose article were 11% less likely to eat junk food or soda and more likely to eat a healthy snack. So they were doing the right thing, not because they were told, this is healthy, you should eat carrots. It was, don't eat Twinkies because these people are cynically trying to exploit your peer group and they're going to poison you. I'm paraphrasing. And very, very similar strategy worked with cigarettes. Same thing. Both published in the preceding National Academy of Science in the last couple of years. So summing it up, I would say teens are uniquely vulnerable to both anxiety and to risk-taking behaviors. The vast majority of teenagers survive, obviously, and that there is a lot that we could do to sort of mitigate some of these unhealthy behaviors that parents can do along the lines of what we talked about. So I think I'll stop and we can have a discussion section. Thank you.
Maybe I'll lead off. We talked a lot about impulsive behavior and high risk-taking and seeking, and didn't talk about the seeming paradox of the opposite. We talked a little bit about the increase in suicide among adolescents, and that seems to be almost antithetical to the idea of this increased novelty seeking and risk-taking. What are your thoughts about the drivers of this obverse behavior?
You mean suicide?
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's a fascinating question. There's a fair amount of impulsivity that's involved in suicide. But the biggest risk factor for suicide that's driving this in adolescence is psychiatric illness, is depression, is untreated depression. And a lot of that is driven by a combination of genes and the social pressures that teenagers feel, particularly bullying. And and now in the digital age, with smartphones and digital media, the influences that we had when we were young are now kind of viral and magnified on a level which is unprecedented.
I'll ask also about this incredible observation of the plasticity and the ability to learn things, right? So as an adult, if we want to learn a new language, learning the rules, learning the grammar, learning the individual words and their meaning and translations seems incredibly tough, and yet nobody sits down to teach a 2-year-old about syntax or language, and they just acquire it on the fly. What changes in the brain that makes us so able to learn things quickly as youngsters that goes away as we age?
Well, there's early in life, the brain overproduces synaptic connections, and then it's called sculpting to change, but also to get rid of connections that are perhaps not so important and create new connections. The rate of neurogenesis that I mentioned is much higher, although it doesn't completely cease as we get older, fortunately. So there's a lot more plasticity and a lot more plasticity that can respond then to these environmental inputs like learning to read, learning language, and so forth. Plasticity never ends, however, but it changes and is reduced in its scope. And one of the challenges, of course, is to figure out when things have happened, like learning a language later in life is something that is, some people do it better than others, but it never is as good as learning it very early in life. There's another study that shows that women, as they are pregnant, their brain is sculpted and so to speak. And the more of the sculpting, and it's been characterized, the better the attachment to the child. And we know that musicians have sculpting of their motor and sensory cortex in a way that's different from other people. So there's specialization going on all the time, and yet that specialization still allows for plasticity, but a more limited amount as we get older.
Does that tie in any way to the role of sleep and what happens in sleep deprivation?
Absolutely, and I think one of the biggest problems in teen years, not just for teenagers, is paying attention to the world around them, especially to the peer pressure, and losing sleep at night. And I think this is, of course, one of the biggest concerns that certainly teachers and parents have. I noticed the other night there are schools that have installed a sleep pod so that kids who are sleep deprived can actually take a 20-minute nap. And there was a very careful explanation about a 20-minute nap really refreshes you. Other school
We might do that
districts-
here at Rockefeller.
Well, it's maybe a good idea. And other school districts then move ahead the start time to take advantage of this. Well, that affects the whole school day, and so there's a real crisis, I think, related to sleep deprivation and its effects on the brain, because it does, as you heard in the description, it alters the way these synapses that are being replaced and so on are actually the rate at which this is happening.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that kids are night owls by their chronotype. I mean, most, if you just developmentally, most teenagers like to go to bed at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. And then as they get older, their pattern changes and they start going to bed at earlier times. But if they make it out of their teen years and they're still night owls, they're going to be night owls forever. And now with smartphones, with all that blue light that comes out of the smart devices, which shifts the circadian rhythm even later. So now they're lying in bed awake, looking at these screens, and their circadian rhythm is being, delayed even further. Yeah. So they can't get to sleep until 4 or 5. Yeah. It's a huge problem.
Fascinating. Questions from the audience in the back. A microphone will reach you momentarily.
That I'm trying to figure out with our kids is giving them independence and allowing them to fail. And I think that it's so important for kids to learn to fail in a protected environment. I feel like I'm a salmon swimming upstream because I'm not sure everybody agrees with that. I think in the schools in particular, it's difficult if the kids are doing work any less than B. And I'm fine with our kids getting C's and learning how you need to work for success. But in terms of helping kids learn to fail and gain some independence in a city that's very much on top of the kids, what do you suggest doing?
I'm so glad that you asked that question. I think that everyone heard the comment, the importance of allowing people to have the opportunity to take risks and perhaps fail, which is important because if you don't do that and people grow up, they grow up unaccustomed to the idea of adversity, which is, part of life. How can you possibly get along in the world if you haven't had the experience to, deal with adversity? And failure is a great teacher. It's painful, but, if you try to protect them, you're not really doing them a service. And as you said, you can try to do it in the safest way possible, but there's no getting around the fact that it hurts. And that it's painful. It's just that I think if you give them the message, you'll still love them. They're still great people. It's not lethal. And they see this by the model that you are. That you can explain to them. When I was your age, I took a course that was much harder, and I got a D. Or I was the last on the swim team. Or anything that's related to your own experience that would resonate, that you can share with them, would make it obvious that it's possible to endure failure and survive and be resilient.
And learning to be resilient is itself a learning process. When you run into a bad situation, learning that having enough self-esteem to know I can make my way out of this.
Right.
That's an extremely important experience.
Right. That's just critically important.
So let's, many questions. There's a microphone right here, and if we could get microphones to other people with their hands up. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. I've wondered whether the widely reported rise in casual sex and dangerous sexual behavior over the last sort of 10 years has any link to helicoptering. It does, it's at least coincident that helicoptered children are now having sort of more free and dangerous sex. And I wonder what you make of that and whether you think there's any causality there.
I mean, it's hard to know what to make of observational data like that because, you know, it's tempting to link the two things together and say, well, you know, young people are so oppositional that if you follow them around and try to patrol them and control them, you will produce the opposite behavior. I mean, anecdotally, we think it's the case, but who knows whether those two things are causally related. The other is, you know, kids are notoriously secretive about sex. And so the kind of data that you get and whether the data are any good just depends on how you ask. So you may see a trend in time over, you know, 10 or 20 years, but part of it's an artifact of how you measure it and whether your questionnaires 10 years ago are like the questionnaires now. So I'm not sure what to make of it. I mean, it's interesting. I just don't know whether they're causally related.
I was reflecting on your comments about evolution and its importance in shaping behaviors, and the oppositional behavior, I think, has as much influence to prepare the parents to be ready for separation as it does on the children. At least that's been our experience. So, who else has a microphone? It's a microphone there. Yes.
Hi. Is anxiety and depression more prevalent today than generations past, or are we just better at diagnosing it, or accepting it socially? Was it really different during World War II or World War I, or are there very anxious times than it is today?
So there's a well-known trend for increasing rates, prevalence of depression in successive cohorts. This called, you know, people started to worry about an agent blue many years ago. Jerry Clarman, who used to be at Cornell, was among the first to figure this out. So in all Western industrial nations, successive cohorts have higher rates of depression. Not so much anxiety disorders, but depression. And some people speculate that maybe that's the result of, you know, changing social expectations, particularly in women, because women are 3 times as likely to be depressed as men. So it does seem to be the case that the rates of depression are going up. Not clear if that's true for anxiety.
Great. Question? Yes. And if you have a question, raise your hand, and please get microphones to people with their hands up. Thanks.
Thank you. My children are 19, 18.
We'll get microphones down to the front.
My children are 19, 18, and 14, girl, boy, boy. The middle child has had a minor incident, I would say, in school, and I've taken a pretty hard line as it relates to drugs. And I believe now he's sort of coming out the other side, that the reason why it's been fairly successful, from what I know, is because he knows that it's coming from a very loving place. So the firmness is accompanied by love. Unconditional love, but not everything you do is good kind of love. So I'm wondering, in your study where you talk about how the oppositional approach works. I mean, I basically said no drugs. I don't have any. It doesn't mean they won't do it. I said you'll be an adult at one point. You'll do what you wish. I'm wondering how the relationship that the parent has with the child would affect your view of the parent's willingness to put their foot down firmly.
Right. Well, I think it's a critical distinction that you make between, you know, approval and love. You can love your teenager but not approve of what they're doing, and that's a critical distinction to make. And I don't want to give the impression that that model for leveraging oppositional behavior in kids applies to all behaviors. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily want to say to your kid, you know, go out and get drunk, have a ball. and have alcohol poisoning and die. Apparently, those sorts of studies are not generalizable to all kinds of behaviors. So I definitely wouldn't think that's a good idea. On the other hand, it's true that most teenagers who experiment with drugs don't ever get addicted to them. It's really a minority of kids who run into trouble. Most kids try things and then do it a couple of times, and it does not become an issue with dependence.
So we got a question here. If we get a microphone down to this woman, and in the meantime, we'll take a question up here. Hey. Please go ahead.
Okay. I had a question regarding screens and depression and what your views are on the effects of social media and teen anxiety and depression.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
I have a question regarding screens, like electronic media and social media, and what your views are on the effect of the increased usage of screens as opposed to personal interactions and the increase of teen anxiety and depression.
Such a great question. I don't think there's very good data to answer the question. I mean, it's known that like direct personal contact, that social networks are really important in mental health. It's known less in teenagers than it is known in adults, but the phenomenon of digital technology is just too new for the researchers I know who study it to even know what the answer is. I mean, a lot of people worry that these virtual connections that you have with people might not be the equivalent of direct face-to-face contact, but we don't know that's the case. It may be that if you already have a friend, and you know them, and you have a normal sort of old-fashioned relationship with them, it may be that a virtual, Skype or digital contact with them is equivalent to direct interaction. On the other hand, maybe meeting new people or having new relationships virtually is not. So I think we just don't know.
But how about if those electronic relationships would substitute? From what I see with a lot of kids, instead of going out and going to the corner store for a soda or whatever with their friends, they're sitting on the devices.
I know people worry about this. Well, I mean, you can see kids who sit, they're standing around and they're texting one another. So we're sitting here and I'm texting Rick and he's texting back, and okay, but there is a social interaction, and we have no reason to believe that's adverse. We may not like it, but it may not be bad.
Great. Thank you. Right here.
What new stress, the heavy stress, does to an adult. I do not know scientifically what it triggers to be beneficial to the system or even necessary. But is there what hormones it triggers or how it happens, but is there a way of inducing that to an adolescent who is suffering from this stress?
I don't know.
Well, I think it has to do with this issue probably of learning to develop some confidence in yourself. It's self-esteem, and knowing that you can handle a situation. You don't have to pay attention, for example, to peers. You can be independent, do something that you believe is right, and not be influenced by that. And this, of course, is going to be very much dependent on the development of the proper connections, as we've both been talking about, especially this area, the prefrontal cortex, which is developing more slowly. And by the way, on the average, it develops more slowly or faster in girls than in boys, which is one of the reasons why boys have such high auto insurance rates, among other things. So,
it's right here.
Hi, I was just wondering, I noticed that a lot of kids this day, while they want independence, they want you to take care of a lot of things for them. They think they need a lady in waiting at all times. How do you get them to just do it and not ask you about it?
How do you get them to?
Just take care of things, not be so dependent on you.
If I knew the answer to that question, I'd be a very wealthy man.
So we have the question in the back and then here.
Yes. So earlier you mentioned the trigger warnings and safe spaces in universities. So I'm wondering, I've been touring a lot of universities recently with my sister, who's going to college, and I know it's important for my sister and other youngsters to really be exposed to different views and other things they may not agree with in a healthy way. So I'm wondering, is it really good for our youngsters to have so many safe spaces in universities, and could that be positive or even actually more negative to them?
Uh-oh. So I'll give you my universal warning, which I give to all the students, the trigger warning. This is the trigger warning I say. Guys, the purpose of education is to enlarge your understanding of yourself and the world, which means you'll learn things and you'll meet ideas and people. Some of them will seem strange, some you won't like, some will be repellent. It's okay. That's just part of education. If along the way you get really upset by this in a way that's hard for you to deal with, then you have a problem, and come and see me and we'll help you. But the answer is not to say, we'll protect you, and we're going to warn you because on page 35 there might be an idea or a phrase that will upset you. And the reason I think it's such a bad idea is, in life, do you really think that in the world when somebody is walking around, you're going to see a sign that says, hey, in 400 meters, take a right. There's a bad idea on the left. You've got to be kidding me. So no, I think it's a terrible idea. On the other hand, cruelty, bullying and incivility are really bad. There are responsibilities to be civil to one another, but on the other hand, to protect people from strange ideas and is well intended, but I think it's a really bad idea.
We have thank you. We have a microphone here, then a microphone there, and then there's a gentleman 3 rows back who has a question. Please.
Do you think that early childhood mental health intervention, both drug and therapy, is helpful in preventing episodes during adolescence, serious episodes like depression or suicide? Or is it all genetic, so it doesn't make any difference?
Oh, wow. No, it's not all genetic, and most diseases are gene by environment outcomes anyway, so what you do to intervene can make an enormous difference. If you identify these problems early on, you can literally change the trajectory for life in these kids. Most adults have the onset of their problems when they're young, and if you take their histories, and it's been done many times, the average time between the onset of the problem and the first time they get help for the problem is on the average of 15 years. So obviously, the emphasis should be on early identification and treatment, because you will change it.
Just to say, the nurse-family partnership is an example of an intervention program which you can find online to help an expectant mother, family, develop the right parenting skills and providing emotional support for the experience of pregnancy and early and childhood, and it's become very effective. It's actually in terms of return on investment, even though it may take decades before you see it, it's a very effective program with a return of estimated 5 to 1, 7 to 1, and so on. So it's definitely the answer is yes. Early interventions of that kind, teaching parenting skills and providing emotional support to the family is very beneficial in the long run.
So a question here.
I feel like that's the perfect transition to my question, which I understood your point about that there's a certain tipping point where the propensity to become fearful, develop anxiety, develop depression occurs neurobiologically. And as the parent of a toddler, I'm wondering, you need to inform young children about things that are important to be fearful of in the world. That stove could burn you, etc. Where's that sweet spot where you really allow for more independence without making children feel like the world is such a scary place?
What a great question. So, You know, most people, getting back to your question and the one before it, think that these behaviors are so hardwired. But you know, when it comes to things like anxiety, it's pretty clear that, you know, anxiety is learned to a large extent. So you're not entirely free to set that threshold. And the question itself that you're asking shows that you already can think about how to titrate it. If the situation makes you anxious, that's a pretty good indicator that there's a danger. But on the other hand, what if it turned out that you were an unreasonably anxious person? So the alarm is gonna go off and you're gonna say, no, don't do that. You could see it all the time. So it's a hard question to answer because you wanna say, well, you want the golden mean. But if you're an anxious mother, or if you're temperamentally, if you have a lot of worry and anxiety, you have to censor it. You have to exert a lot of energy to say, wait a minute, I know this is not rational and I should not tell them, don't do this, because that's my problem and it shouldn't become their problem. So the answer depends on how anxious you are as a parent.
We have a question here, two questions back in the back, and we're running out of time. So please make your questions brief.
Question. I was wondering, is there any correlation between highly intelligent individuals, by whatever means you define individual intelligence, artistically, or cognitively, or whatever, and stress levels of these individuals? And also, are there any correlation between these individuals and suicide rates? The highly intelligent, by whatever definition, you know, artistically, composers, Nobel Prize winners, or whatever.
So there is not a very good correlation between any mental disorder and intelligence level, no matter how you measure it. There are, yeah, I know, it's
highly intelligent comedian who committed suicide.
Yeah, but those are anecdotes. There's a relationship between, right, but there is a correlation between certain mental disorders and creativity, like bipolar disorder, but that's the only one for which there's any good data.
Two last questions up here.
Bruce, this question is for you. It's about chronic cortisol issues. I'm certain there are probably many of us in this room that feel that we have chronic cortisol and stress. You'd mentioned exercise, sort of 5 days a week, walking. Is there anything else that would be helpful?
Well, physical activity is very important, and it means people use stand-up desks. I walk my dog, or they walk me. I mean, there are many ways of getting physical activity. And then, of course, the social interactions, getting decent sleep at night, creating as normal as possible circadian diurnal cycle, and the usual sort of diet and alcohol and so on. But I think the often neglected are social interactions, positive social interactions as opposed to isolation, and the sleep aspects of it, circadian cycle, and not turning on your cell phone in the middle of the night and disrupting your circadian rhythm.
And our last question up here.
Why do adverse memories in the teenage years tend to be stickier neurobiologically?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Why do, you mentioned that difficult teenage memories get burned in. Why are those stickier neurobiologically, and what can reverse those?
So what I meant by that was specifically fear memory. Not all memory, fear memory. And to the extent that teenagers are in their height of neuroplasticity, memory in general, but it actually changes. So as they grow out of adolescence, it becomes easier once again for them to become desensitized and to unlearn inappropriate fears. So it's specific to that sort of period of adolescence because of the way the brain is developing and the prefrontal cortex is not yet online. So there's not a whole lot that you need to do. Neurodevelopment takes care of it.
One thing for people who are interested in early childhood development, the website for the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child is an incredible resource with everything from cartoon videos and white papers and other material. And anyone who's interested in exploring that should look that website up. National Scientific Council on the Developing Child.
Terrific. And with that, I'd like to thank Bruce and Richard for a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much.